Hey there. Tonight I want to bring you into a winter so cold that the walls themselves seem to shiver. You are standing in medieval England, somewhere around the middle of the 13th century, with frost silvering the village green, smoke crawling low across the roofs, and a hut ahead of you that looks as though one hard wind might persuade it to sit down forever. And the strange thing is, people still called such a place home. They trusted mud to stand against ice, straw to hold back rain, and a little orange fire to keep death waiting outside one more night. If that sounds like your kind of quiet journey, settle in. And if you enjoy these slow stories, like the video and subscribe. Then let your shoulders drop, unclench your jaw, and breathe as though the room around you is dimming into candlelight and ash. Morning comes thin and pale, the kind of morning that does not so much arrive as slowly reveal that the darkness never truly warmed. You wake under a rough wool covering that smells faintly of smoke and sheep, and the first thing you notice is your own breath. It hangs before your face in a white cloud, delicate and temporary, then vanishes. Above you, the roof crackles softly, not loudly, not dramatically, just a tiny dry whisper, as if the frost has found each straw in the thatch and touched it in passing. Outside, the world is hard with cold. The field beyond the fence is rimed in white, each blade of grass caught in a glassy edge. The ox tethered nearby has frost clinging to the hair along its back, and when it turns its heavy head, the rope gives a little stiff sound. Somewhere, farther off, a crow cuts through the stillness with one harsh cry. Honestly, I have always found crows slightly unfair. They always sound as though they know something you do not, and in a medieval winter, that feels especially rude. You stand before a hut on the edge of the village and see at once how uncertain shelter used to be. The walls are not stone, not brick, not even anything that would satisfy a modern eye for straightness. They are a compromise made visible. Timber posts, curved and dark, earth packed around them, straw caught in the seams, a roof that dips just slightly where too many storms have leaned upon it. Nothing about it suggests certainty. Everything about it suggests persistence. Before houses became things of symmetry and confidence, shelter in rural England was often shaped out of whatever the land allowed. Mud, branch, rough-cut timber, reeds from wet ground, dung from animals that had to be kept alive because they were food, labor, or both. You built with what you could gather before the cold made your hands too stiff to work. You repaired with what was nearest. If the roof sagged, you added straw. If the wall cracked, you pressed in more clay. If the door no longer sat true in its frame, you shoved cloth or moss in the gap and told yourself the wind was less sharp tonight than it had been yesterday. Historians often describe some of the earliest rural dwellings in medieval England as cruck-framed huts. The phrase sounds almost elegant now, which is a little misleading. A cruck frame was, in simple terms, a pair of great curved timbers meeting high overhead like the ribs of an animal. A skeleton first, a body later. Once those timbers were raised, the spaces between them could be filled with woven rods and daub, or boarded, or packed with whatever the village could spare. If you were standing here with me, you would see that the hut does indeed resemble a rib cage. Not dead. Exactly. More like a beast that has lain down in the field and agreed, for a season, to keep people inside its breathing bones. You step closer and touch the wall. It is cold, damp near the bottom, firmer higher up where smoke and heat have dried it over time. The outer skin is made from daub, that wonderfully unglamorous mixture of mud, clay, straw, and animal dung. It sounds unpleasant because, to be fair, it was unpleasant. Yet it worked. Pressed into a woven frame and left to dry, it held back the wind well enough to matter. And in winter, a thing does not have to be beautiful to be miraculous. It only has to stand between your sleeping child and the frost. There is still debate, of course, over how durable such walls really were. Scholars argue over lifespans, maintenance cycles, how often they slumped, how quickly wet winters could undo a season of labor. But that uncertainty feels faithful to the people who lived inside them. They, too, must have wondered each year whether the same wall would endure another January. They knew its strengths. They knew its moods. A house like this was less an object than a companion, temperamental and needy, forever requiring attention, forever threatening to return to the soil from which it came. Inside, the air changes at once. It is warmer, yes, but not cleanly so. Warmth here comes braided with smoke and damp wool and old straw and the faint sourness of earth that never fully dries. There are no glass windows, no bright rectangle admitting winter light. Perhaps there is a small opening, perhaps only a shutter, perhaps nothing but the doorway and the smoke hole above the hearth. The dimness is complete enough that the eye needs a moment to adjust. When it does, shapes gather slowly. A stool, a pot, a pile of straw rushes spread over packed dirt, a blanket folded in the corner, a pair of hands stretched toward embers. The hearth sits low, little more than a fire pit arranged with stone and habit. Smoke rises, but lazily, not obediently. Some of it finds the hole above. Some of it drifts sideways, collecting under the roof beams in a gray band that thickens and thins with every change in the wind. It stings your eyes almost immediately. You blink. Your throat feels it too. Medieval life was full of small negotiations with discomfort, and smoke was one of the most constant. Still, people tolerated it because smoke did its own kind of work. It dried the timbers. It discouraged insects. It preserved the thatch. It clung to cloth, skin, and hair until an entire household smelled of fire, even when no flame was visible. People sit close in such places. That may be the first true law of winter shelter. Not elegance, not insulation, not engineering. Closeness, shoulder against shoulder, knees bent toward warmth, hands tucked into sleeves, a child leaning against a mother's side, an old man rubbing his palms and staring into the orange heart of the embers as though he is keeping watch over something holy. The room is small enough that each body matters. Every breath helps. Even the silence feels shared. There are stories, and some are likely true, of villages that suffered terribly in severe winters, Huts collapsed under snow load or were abandoned when walls failed in freezing rain. Roofs shed straw into drifts until only the main posts remained visible, like dark fingers pointing at the sky. Yet villages did not disappear simply because winter wished it. They patched, endured, rebuilt. Spring was not a triumph so much as a work order. Gather more clay. Recut the beams. Mend the door. Replace the rushes. Life continued because it had no better option. One detail from the archaeological record is especially haunting. Some early dwellings appear to have been partly sunken into the ground. Not deep enough to become caves, but low enough that the earth itself offered protection from wind. A house like a shallow bowl, with walls rising only a little above the surface. The idea makes immediate sense in cold weather. The ground keeps a steadier temperature than the air. Sink part of your shelter into it, and perhaps you steal a little of that steadiness back. But then comes the other side of the bargain. Water. Mud. Thaw. A house that is warm enough in frost may become a miserable puddle when winter loosens its grip. Cozy refuge or damp nightmare. That, too, remains debated. Imagine crouching beside such a half-buried shelter at dusk. The fire hisses because the wood is not as dry as you hoped. Your knees ache from cold. The air smells of wet clay and smoke, and a little of the stream nearby, locked under a pale skin of ice. From where you kneel, the village seems lower than the sky, tucked into the land, like something that wants not to be seen. The stars come early in winter. They look harder than summer stars, brighter and less forgiving. You hear a dog bark once, then stop. Someone coughs in another hut. A door thuds shut. Then only wind, moving along the seams of the walls like fingers searching for entry. The miracle, if we can call it that, is not that these shelters were perfect. It is that they were enough. Not always. Not for everyone. But often enough that people married, raised children, mended tools, told stories, and waited out another season within them. They learned the sounds of their own roofs, the way a beam groaned before snowslide, the note the door made when frost thickened around it, the smell that meant the daub needed patching, the exact place by the hearth where an infant could sleep without taking too much smoke into small lungs. You lie down now on a bed that is hardly a bed by our standards. Straw beneath, wool above, earth below all of it. The hut mutters softly around you, a little settling in the frame, a sift of ash in the pit, the wind brushing one side, then the other. In the darkness, your breath appears and disappears, appears and disappears. A tiny white ghost, living only long enough to remind you how cold it still is. Yet the embers hold. They breathe red under gray ash. Somewhere in the corner another sleeper turns, and the straw whispers. And there, in that narrow space between discomfort and danger, you begin to feel the first shape of medieval ingenuity. Not grand invention, not the confidence of later cottages and chimneys and glazed windows, but something smaller and perhaps more moving. A refusal to surrender. A decision repeated by hand, by season, by village. We will bank the fire. We will patch the wall. We will pull the blanket closer. We will trust mud and timber one more night. The cold remains outside, patient as ever. But inside this frail shelter, a different patience answers it. The patience of people who understand that a home does not have to conquer winter. It only has to outlast the night. And when dawn comes again, with frost lacing the threshold and the crow calling over the fields, the work of building better walls will begin. Later, when the fire has been fed and the room settles into its long evening hush, you begin to notice all the little strategies hidden inside the hut. A cloak folded and tucked along the bottom of the door where the draft is strongest. A broken basket leaned against a wall crack to slow the wind. Straw thickened in the corner where the oldest sleeper lies. Nothing here is accidental. Even poverty arranges itself with care when the season is cruel enough. A modern room often wastes its comforts without noticing. This hut notices everything. Every finger of warmth has to be directed, guarded, coaxed into usefulness. Someone shifts the pot so that its remaining heat radiates toward the bedding. Someone else pulls a stool a few inches closer to the embers, then stops there, because too close means smoke in the face and cloth at risk of stray sparks. The balance is delicate. Warmth and hazard, light and choking darkness, all existing together in the same small circle. It is easy to imagine medieval survival as blunt endurance, but really it was often a matter of fine adjustments. A handspan nearer, a log turned this way instead of that, a child moved away from the wall, a blanket tucked under instead of over. These tiny decisions, repeated night after night, built the margin between sleeping and shivering. If you listen carefully, even the hut's silence is layered, the embers settling with a faint click, the scrape of a sleeve against straw, the low breathing of people who are tired enough to sleep despite the smoke. From somewhere beyond the wall comes the muffled sound of another household, a cough, then murmured voices, then the brief bark of laughter cut short, as if laughter itself ought not waste heat. The village is full of such dim islands, each one holding its own red center against the dark. No single hut looks impressive from outside. Together they form a kind of scattered constellation on the land, each roof low, each wall uncertain, each doorway breathing smoke into the freezing air. And perhaps that is the quiet truth hidden inside this first chapter of Winter Shelter. A house did not begin as a declaration of comfort. It began as a pause in suffering, a stay against exposure, a way of making night narrower, wind softer, morning more possible. You drift towards sleep knowing the hut is imperfect in every visible way, and yet it has accomplished the only task that matters. It has held back the cold long enough for hope to survive until dawn. Epic classical oil painting style, dramatic blue and gold palette, visible heavy brush strokes. Inside a quiet, shadowed temple infirmary, a young North African child lies resting on a pallet. A shaft of brilliant silver moonlight falls from a high window directly onto the child. Action. Camera. The camera moves slowly toward the child's face as the silver light seems to ripple and soak into their skin. Lighting volumetric silver light beam in a dark blue, dusty atmosphere. The sound of axes reaches you before the men do. It moves through the winter wood in measured blows, each strike carrying across the frozen ground with a clean, hard note. then fading into the stillness between the trunks. You follow it through the bare trees, your boots crunching over leaves sealed under frost, and the air smells of bark, sap, and cold iron. This is where many medieval homes truly begin. Not in the village lane, not at the doorway, but here, among the standing trees where the shape of a roof is still hidden inside a trunk. You come into a small clearing and find 3 men at work around an oak. Their sleeves are rolled despite the cold, their hands reddened and rough, and their breaths rise in pale bursts as they swing. One chops low at the cut. Another stands ready with wedges. The third watches the lean of the trunk with the solemn concentration of a man who knows that a falling tree is not a thing to be guessed at. No one wastes movement. No one speaks more than necessary. The sound of labor is enough. Timber means shelter. It means beams that will hold a roof above sleeping people. It means doorposts that do not twist too quickly, rafters that can carry straw and winter rain, pegs and braces, and all the cunning little bones that keep a house upright when the wind begins to worry at it after dark. Before metal nails became ordinary in village building, people relied on wood meeting wood with intelligence. Slots, pegs, wedges, mortises, tenons, all those quiet decisions by which a frame stands because it has been understood. It is often noted in records from the period that villages depended upon men who knew the forest the way others knew prayer or weather. A woodwright did not merely cut, he judged. He laid a hand on bark and felt whether a tree had grown straight enough for a post or with too much twist for anything but fuel. He looked upward at branching and measured in his mind the future shape of a beam. He knew which timber would split cleanly, which would cup as it dried, which one had drunk too much water from marshy ground and would betray a roof after a few wet seasons. These were not small matters. A poor choice in the forest could become a leak over a cradle 6 months later. One of the men steps forward now and taps the oak before striking again. It is a brief gesture, easy to miss, and it might be habit more than belief. Yet customs linger in such moments. In many places there was a quiet sense that a tree should not be taken without acknowledgement. Some whispered to it. Some laid a hand on the trunk. Some said nothing at all, but still gave it that little tap as if to warn the living wood that it was about to become something else. A superstition, perhaps, though I suspect it was also manners. Medieval people lived too close to the natural world to pretend it had no presence. The oak begins to complain. The cut deepens. Wedges go in. There is a crack that runs upward through the trunk with a sound almost like a long-drawn breath. Then the whole tree shifts. Not fast at first, but with a deliberate, terrible grace. Branches steer. Birds startle up in a dark little scatter. The men step back, eyes never leaving the fall. When it comes down at last, the ground trembles under your boots. Snow dust lifts from nearby branches. The smell of fresh split wood rushes into the air, sweet and green and strangely warm, smelling despite the cold. You go closer after the fall and lay your hand on the exposed heartwood. It is smooth and damp. Sap beads faintly along the cut. The scent is richer here, almost honeyed. It is easy to forget how alive a beam once was when you see it later blackened above a hearth or weathered gray under thatch. But in this moment, The future house is still a tree, still fragrant, still carrying the memory of roots. The work changes after the fall. What was a vertical giant must become something transportable, then useful. Branches are stripped. The men work with adzes and axes, shaping, trimming, squaring where they can. Chips gather around their boots. The ox cart waits at the edge of the clearing, patient and steaming in the cold. Every piece matters. Large lengths for major posts, smaller poles for roof work, crooked sections saved for braces or hurdles, brush for kindling, bark for little uses no one bothers to list because every household already knows them. Waste is a luxury a winter village does not possess. Back in the village, cut timber changes the mood of a place. Fresh logs, stacked beside half-built walls, are like promises made visible. Children run between them pretending they are fortresses or ships. Dogs nose the bark. Women passing with bundles of straw glance at the pile, with the same kind of relieved measuring look that people reserve for food stores and healthy livestock. A village may not speak often of fear, but fear lives quietly in every glance toward weather, grain, and wood. It is well known that timber-framed houses became one of the defining forms of English domestic building. Oak especially, where it could be had, offered strength and longevity. Elm, ash, and other woods entered the picture, according to region and means. What mattered most was not perfection of species, but practical understanding. A frame needed to carry weight without spreading, twisting, or settling too cruelly as the seasons turned. Joined well, such structures could outlast the people who first raised them. Joined poorly, they might lean after the first harsh winter and spend the next 20 years apologizing. You watch a frame raising now in the village, and the event feels almost festive despite the cold. Neighbors gather because they must. A house frame is not lifted by one pair of hands. Ropes are laid. Pegs are prepared. Men brace themselves, boots slipping in frozen mud, while others call directions that are half orders and half prayer. The main bent rises slowly from the ground, huge against the pale sky, its shape so simple and so final that for a moment it seems impossible that it was ever scattered through the forest as separate trunks and branches. Now it is a house beginning to declare itself. When the frame settles into place and the peg is driven home, a cheer breaks out. Not loud, not polished, but real. Someone wipes a sleeve across a face shining with sweat despite the cold. Someone else laughs, because laughter is what comes after tension has left the body. If there is food to spare, there may even be a little feast of sorts. Onions roasting near the fire, coarse bread passed around, thin ale, if fortune is kind. Warmth earned tastes, different from warmth received. The whole village seems to know this. Yet timber also lives inside law and scarcity. Not every tree belongs to the hand that needs it. Royal forests, especially, were guarded by rules that looked very orderly on parchment and much less reasonable to people with leaking roofs. Records survive of fines and punishments for unauthorized cutting, though hardship had a way of driving people into woods by night with muffled tools and guilty silence. Better to risk a fine than to let snow into the sleeping space. Better to steal one beam than to watch a child cough under a dripping roof. Medieval law may have had a stern face, but winter was sterner. There is an uneasiness in the woods because of this. Every cut is practical, but also final. Stand among the stumps after a season of hard gathering, and you can feel the village counting what remains. Some historians argue that England had already seen much clearing by the 12th and 13th centuries. Others place the most dramatic losses later, under pressure from ironwork, ships, and growing population. But even without settling every scholarly quarrel, you can sense that timber was never simply abundant. It was always being turned from landscape into necessity. That may be why practices like coppicing mattered so much. Cut carefully. Allow the stool to throw up new shoots. Return in years to harvest again. A kind of renewal, born not of modern environmental sentiment, but of desperate prudence. The villagers did not preserve woods because they were sentimental about scenery. They preserved woods because winter would come back, and roofs had long memories. By late afternoon, the trimmed beams lie in ordered piles near the house site. Their ends are pale where freshly cut. Some bear smoke stains from previous use, because reuse was common and sensible. A timber pulled from a collapsed cottage, cleaned and trimmed, could serve another generation under another family. Wood remembered. Wood carried one winter into the next. There is something deeply moving in that. A blackened beam set into a new frame, still holding the ghost of another hearth. Inside your own hut that evening, the smell of fresh oak enters before the beam itself ever becomes part of a wall. It clings to your sleeves, to the ropes, to the cart. You set your hand on one stacked piece and feel that faint damp coolness in the grain. Beyond the door, the forest stands dark, retreating into mist and distance. Here, in the lane, its heart has been brought close and turned toward shelter. The tree that stood against wind now will keep wind off sleeping faces. The transformation feels almost liturgical. The fire flickers low. Outside, the night begins to harden again. You can hear the timber frame nearby creak just a little as the cold takes hold of it. Not a dangerous sound. Only the first conversation between wood and weather. More will follow. Every house in medieval England learned to speak in groans, clicks, and sighs. Timber expands, shrinks, settles, strains. It never truly stops remembering that it was once alive. You sit a little longer and think about the village as a thing built from the living world. Mud from the ground, straw from the field, wood from the forest, smoke from all three turned into heat. Medieval shelter was never cleanly separate from nature. It was nature persuaded to stand in a different arrangement for a while. A roofline where once there was a tree. A wall where once there was clay under grass. A bed where once there was straw waving in summer wind. And perhaps that is why these houses, however rough, feel so intimate. They are not imposed upon the landscape in the way later buildings sometimes are. They are borrowed from it. Every winter, people went back to the land and asked again. A little more wood, a little more straw, a little more time, and often just enough was given. When you lie down that night, the smell of oak is still in the room. It mingles with ash, wool, and the faint animal warmth from the corner. Somewhere in the distance, a tree shifts in the night wind. Somewhere nearer, a new frame stands against the sky, its joints tight, its beams pale in the moonlight, waiting for wall, roof, and life to gather around it. You close your eyes, knowing that tomorrow hands will rise with the dawn and continue the work. Beam by beam, notch by notch, patient as winter itself, stubborn as any people who have decided they mean to survive it. In the morning, the village wakes early again, because timber left too long in weather becomes another problem to solve. You step outside and find frost laid silver along the newly cut beams. It catches in the adze marks and glints in the little splinters left from yesterday's shaping. One of the carpenters runs his hand along a joint and nods, pleased that the fit has held through the freezing night. That nod matters. It is a verdict, a promise that the frame can go on becoming a house. The carpenter's tools lie wrapped in cloth nearby, and when he opens them, there is the same careful reverence another man might reserve for church silver. Adze, auger, mallet, narrow saw, a handful of iron pieces precious enough to be counted twice. In many villages, such craftsmen were respected not because they were romantic figures, but because they were necessary. A bad harvest frightened people. So did a bad carpenter. One took away food. The other took away the wall that stood between fire and storm. You watch him mark another beam with charcoal. Black lines on pale wood, simple and exact. He cuts a mortise slowly, the wood yielding in crisp little chips, then fits the tenon with a test press that seems almost too gentle for such a heavy thing. Yet that is the secret. Perhaps. Strength in this world is often expressed through patience rather than force. He does not bully the wood. He persuades it into service. By noon, another section is ready, and the frame grows one decision at a time. Each joint, a tiny treaty between material, weather, and human need. When the sun begins to slide down and the village smoke turns gold in the low light, you look back toward the edge of the wood. It stands dark and quiet, diminished, perhaps, but still present. The village has taken part of it and turned that taking into warmth. There is no sentimentality in the bargain, but there is respect. The people know what they owe. Every fire in every hearth began as standing timber. Every dry night under a roof traces back to some cold day among bare branches. The house is not only built, it is remembered into being. And in that remembering, in the smell of fresh cut oak and the sound of a mallet seating wood against wood, you hear medieval England teaching one of its oldest lessons. Shelter is not simply found. It is shaped from the world with skill, with community, with risk, and with gratitude half spoken and half felt. The beams rise. The winter waits. The village answers with timber. Snow begins in the afternoon, not in a hurry, but with the slow, deliberate grace that makes a village uneasy. The first flakes turn lazily in the air and vanish on the warmth of your sleeve. Then more follow, thin at first, then steady, whitening the lane, the fence rails, the bent backs of thatched roofs. You stand outside the half-finished house and tip your head up for a moment, feeling the cold settle lightly against your skin. The question arrives almost at once. Will the roofs hold? Roofing in medieval England was always half craft, half wager. A good roof could make a poor house livable. A bad roof could undo months of labor in a single wet season. Straw, reed, heather where available. All these humble things had to become a shield against rain, slate, snow, smoke, and time. The art lay not only in laying them on, but in understanding slope, drainage, wind, and the little ugly truths no one boasts about, like the way damp finds weakness faster than any tax collector. A stack of thatching straw waits by the wall now, golden even under the gray day. You pick up a bundle and hear the faint squeak of dry stems against one another. It smells like summer, remembered badly, but fondly. Warm fields, dust, the sweetness of cut grain. In winter, that scent is oddly moving. A roof is the last warmth of harvest held above your head. The thatcher arrives with the weathered patience of a man who knows roofs are built by rhythm more than speed. He moves up the ladder with his tools hanging from his belt, willow ties looped over one arm, and begins the work exactly where he intended, not where an onlooker might assume. Layer, tighten, trim, strike flat. Layer, tighten, trim, strike flat. The flat paddle in his hand makes a low, repeated sound against the straw, more musical than you would expect. A dull, quick tapping that carries across the yard and settles into the ear like a metronome for survival. Done well. Thatch is dense enough to repel weather, yet porous enough to breathe. That is part of the miracle. It sheds rain because of angle and layering, not because it is impermeable in any simple sense. Each bundle overlaps the one beneath it so that water travels outward and down instead of inward. Snow rests on it for a while, then slips. Wind fingers at it, but the tide courses hold. The roof becomes less like cloth and more like fur, a living textured skin that answers weather with flexibility instead of force. Roof pitch matters enormously. In the north, where snow and harsher weather demanded quick shedding, roofs often rose steeper. In the south, broader, lower forms could survive long drizzles if the thatch was thick and tightly laid. Architectural historians still enjoy arguing over exact regional patterns, local custom, economic influence, and all the other details that scholars rightly love. But standing here in a whitening yard, you do not need a lecture to understand the principle. Snow that stays becomes weight. Rain that lingers becomes rot. Angle is mercy. You climb partway up a little ladder yourself and look beneath the eaves. The underside of the roof is a maze of stems and rods, all packed so tightly that very little light comes through. It is not beautiful in a polished sense. It is beautiful the way nests are beautiful, purposeful, layered, made from patient repetition. A mouse might find a way, because mice are medieval specialists in optimism. But wind finds fewer entrances than it found yesterday, and that is enough to warm the heart. There are old beliefs wrapped through the work. Naturally, in some villages, spiders were considered fortunate guests in the thatch. Their webs were thought to help bind the straw, or at least to signal a healthy roof. Knock down every web, and perhaps rain would take offense and come indoors. Superstition. Maybe. But then again, a roof is exactly the sort of thing upon which sensible people become a little mystical. Too much depends on it to feel entirely ordinary. When snow begins to settle in earnest, the thatched surfaces of the village change character. What was once gold turns white and soft-edged. The roofs appear gentler from a distance, as if sleep has fallen over them. Yet beneath that softness lies tension. Every fresh inch is another small test. The thatcher works on with red hands and a squint against the cold. He ties each yelm with practiced precision, tight enough to hold, not so tight that the material breaks under strain. His fingers know what his mouth never bothers to explain. Fire is the roof's great enemy, of course, and the village never entirely forgets that. Church records and manorial notes contain grim references to sparks caught in dry straw, to rows of cottages lost in one wind-driven night, to panic spreading faster than flame because everyone knew what a burning roof meant in winter. Builders experimented as they could. A clay ridge here, a different smoke outlet there, better spacing if the lane allowed. But in most poor settlements, straw remained the choice because it was cheap, warm, familiar, and repairable. People trusted it the way they trust old roads and old dogs, despite all the reasons not to. The relationship between household and roof never ends with construction. A thatched roof is not installed and forgotten. It is visited, checked, patched, coaxed. Moss is pulled away. Loose bundles are retied. Thin spots are built up again before weather can exploit them. Families care for it year after year as if for something half alive. In truth, perhaps it is alive in the only sense that matters. It changes, settles, responds, requires attention, rewards it. Inside the cottage, you can hear the snow differently because of the roof above you. On bare boards or tile, the sound might ring. On thatch, it becomes a softened whisper, a murmur passing over layers of straw. When heavier clumps begin to slide, there is a low, rushing hiss, and then the muffled collapse into the yard below. The sound is oddly comforting. It means the pitch is doing what it should. It means the house is not quietly accepting a burden that may later become disaster. You sit by the hearth and lift your eyes toward the dim underside of the roof. Smoke drifts upward in slow ribbons and loses itself among the darkened rafters. The scent in the room is richer now. Straw warmed by smoke, damp wool drying near the fire, the faint sweetness of stored hay. And underneath it all, the ever-present smell of ash. The roof keeps weather out, but it also keeps smell in. Every medieval house was a little climate, a little atmosphere of its own. One custom from parts of East Anglia and elsewhere tells of hidden charms set beneath the ridge. A woven token, perhaps a carved bit of wood. Something small and secret laid into the bones of the roof to guard against storm. Some think such things were remnants of older pagan practice. Others say they were merely habits of luck. To me, they feel like a perfectly reasonable response to a world where one loose section in a gale could expose a sleeping family to rain, sickness, or worse. A person would be foolish not to ask for help from every source available, earthly or otherwise. By late day, the main courses are in place on the new roof, and the village looks transformed. White fields, brown smoke, pale sky, gold straw beneath a skin of snow. The children stamp little paths between cottages, then stop to look up when a sheet of snow slides suddenly from an eave and bursts on the ground with a soft, powdery sigh. One child laughs. Another gets a face full of it and looks briefly scandalized, as though winter itself has behaved impolitely. You cannot help noticing how much a roof changes not only a house, but the mood inside it. Under good thatch, the wind loses confidence. It may still groan around the corners and prod at the door, but overhead there is a sense of held weather, controlled weather, weather persuaded to move along the proper routes instead of dropping into your bed. Even the fire behaves differently when the room above it is protected. Smoke rises more steadily. Heat lingers. Conversation softens. People lean back rather than hunching in anticipation of drips. A roof also gathers little stories over time. A spider web left untouched. A patch added after a storm. A place where swallows nested one spring, and the family tolerated the mess because it seemed lucky. Another place where sparks once landed, and everyone climbed up with wet cloth in a panic. Medieval roofs were archives written in straw and weather marks. You read them not in words, but in thickness, color, and the memory of past repairs. As dusk approaches, the snow thickens. The whole village seems to draw inward, chimneys and smoke holes breathing into the dark. Through one doorway you glimpse a woman setting a pot beneath a faint drip. Even the best roof leaks a little. Eventually, there is no outrage in her expression, only acceptance. A leak is not betrayal. It is information. Tomorrow someone will go up, pull back the weak patch, relay the bundle, tighten the bind. Survival in this world depends on a calm willingness to do tomorrow's repairs without resenting yesterday's effort. The roof above your own sleeping place breathes quietly with the changing weather. You can hear a bit of snow slip, then stillness, then the wind drawing along the ridge in a low note. The spider near the eave has indeed survived, and now hangs quietly in a corner of smoke-dark light, no doubt feeling quite pleased with itself. Good. Let it stay. Any creature prepared to make a home in thatch deserves the courtesy of being considered part of the household. When the fire is stirred and fresh sparks rise, they paint brief orange shapes on the low ceiling before fading. The room becomes all browns and golds, warm at the center, dim at the edges. Outside, the fields are erased under white. Inside, every line of the roof holds. Every chord stays true. You realize, again, that survival is often rhythmic rather than heroic. Tie, layer, patch, check, repeat. That is how a village keeps its weather on the proper side of the walls. There is another, softer truth hidden in all this roofing labor. A thatched roof is made from harvest turned upward. Summer grain, cut and dried, now lying over sleeping winter bodies. The field does not vanish when it is harvested. Part of it returns as bread. Part of it returns as bedding. Part of it rises above the home and becomes a shield against snow. Medieval life wastes almost nothing because it cannot afford to forget that all comfort has already been paid for in labor. Night comes early, and by then the roof has taken on its real burden. The snow settles, then drifts. The wind picks up just enough to test every edge, yet the house responds with a quiet assurance that feels almost companionable. The thatch muffles. The cords hold. The slope sheds where it must. You sit near the hearth and hear not threat, but whispering. A house talking to winter in a language made of straw. And perhaps that is what a good roof really is. Not merely a cap over walls, but a translation. It takes snow, rain, smoke, and wind and turns them into manageable sounds. Hiss, murmur, drip into a waiting pot, slide into the yard. It transforms danger into maintenance, panic into routine. For medieval people, the transformation was everything. You lie down at last and pull the blanket to your chin. Above you, the roof murmurs to itself. A little settling in the straw. A tiny sift of ash from the smoke drifting upward. Somewhere near the ridge, the hidden charm, if there is one, keeps its own silence. The spider remains motionless. The fire breathes low. Outside, the snow goes on falling, but it no longer feels as though it belongs to your body. It belongs to the world beyond the eaves. Tomorrow, there may be drips. Tomorrow, there may be a section to tighten or a cord to replace. Tomorrow, someone may climb with numb fingers and curse softly at a weak patch. That is acceptable. Tonight, the roof has done its work. It has made the weather distant enough for sleep. Long after midnight, the storm shifts into rain, because English winters enjoy reminding everyone that they can change their mind whenever they please. The roof answers differently now. The soft hush of snow becomes the faint drumming of droplets, then steady threading streams running down the slope. You wake briefly to the sound and listen. There is something almost soothing in it. Water moving where it should, over, down, away. The house is being tested, yes, but also proven. A shallow roof would collect this rain. A neglected one would leak it everywhere. This one channels it outward in 100 silver paths. By dawn, the eaves are dripping in measured rhythm. The village smells transformed. Wet straw, chimney smoke, mud newly softened, the clean, sharp scent of water on old wood. You stand beneath the edge of the roof and watch little rivulets run off in separate threads. The whole place seems alive with drainage. One house hums. Another ticks where drops hit a barrel. Another sends water cleanly away into the yard without complaint. The village has become an instrument played by weather. You catch a handful of roof runoff and let it bead cold in your palm. Some would call it the purest water, filtered through fresh straw and open air. Others would shrug and put a pot beneath the eaves, because water is water and barrels do not fill themselves. Practicality and poetry live side by side here, more comfortably than people often imagine. Inside again, you place a small vessel beneath the one persistent drip that always seems to find a way past the smoke opening. It strikes the bottom with a patient little plink, then another, then another. Strange how quickly a necessary annoyance becomes part of the room's music. Fires sighing, rain tapping, straw holding. Somewhere a tired laugh from another mat. Medieval shelter never quite achieves silence. It achieves something better, perhaps. A conversation of materials all doing their best. And when evening returns once more, the roof, still damp but loyal, releases the day in slow, cool breaths. The storm moves off. A line of pale light appears beneath the clouds. The village settles. Under every slope of straw, people draw a little closer to the hearth and to one another. They trust thread, willow, reed, and patience. They trust the remembered skill in the thatcher's fingers. They trust a spider's luck if it happens to be available. Above all, they trust the roof because they must, and because for one more night it deserves that trust. So the house breathes. The weather mutters. The fire glows. And high above, the thatch goes on doing what medieval England asked of so many things. Bend. Hold. Endure. Morning comes dim and slow, the sort of winter morning that seems to arrive through smoke rather than sunlight. You wake to the smell of old ash and oak char, to the faint red pulse hidden under a gray crust in the hearth, and to the knowledge that before anyone speaks, before anyone eats, before the first bucket is lifted or the first animal is fed, someone must coax the fire back to life. In a medieval house, that small red breath in the ashes is not convenience. It is continuity. It is the quiet thread that ties one night of survival to the next day. You kneel close enough to feel the cold floor through your wool and use a stick to stir the ash gently aside. Beneath it, the embers glow more brightly, as if surprised to be remembered. A little twig, then another. A curl of smoke. A patient breath. Then a thin tongue of flame lifts itself and begins again. The room changes almost at once. Not by warmth, not yet, but by promise. The house has a center once more. It is well attested in manorial accounts, household descriptions, and surviving domestic archaeology that the hearth sat at the heart of medieval life in every sense that mattered. It cooked, dried, cured, warmed, lighted, and gathered. Without it, there was no hot pottage, no dry hose, no warm stones tucked into beds, no pot of water for washing, no glow to stretch the evening after sunset. A house without fire was not really a house at all. It was a shell waiting to become dangerous. In the poorest cottages, the hearth might be little more than a shallow pit edged with stones blackened by years of use. In somewhat better dwellings, it could be a clay-lined basin or a rude raised surface. Whatever its form, everyone in the room oriented themselves around it, physically and spiritually. Meals faced it. Sleep leaned toward it. Conversation circled it. A child waking in darkness would look first for its glow, the way another child in another century might look for a lamp in the hall. You feed in one more stick and hear the first proper crack. The sound is small, but in a winter cottage, it feels decisive. The air soon begins to fill with the familiar layered scent of smoke. Warm resin, damp wool releasing yesterday's wet, old grease from the hanging pot, and the faint sharpness of peat or dung if wood is scarce. To a modern nose, it would likely seem oppressive. To a medieval household, it was reassurance. If it smelled of smoke, it meant the fire lived. If the fire lived, the day could begin. Smoke, of course, was both companion and punishment. In houses without chimneys, it drifted upward through the room, gathered under rafters, then found whatever exit it could through the roof opening, the doorway, or the general generosity of gaps in the walls. It stung the eyes. It roughened the throat. It settled black into timbers and into lungs. And yet it also helped preserve the house. Medieval people understood in lived practical ways that smoke dried the roof, drove insects from the thatch, and discouraged rot in the beams. The same haze that made everyone cough also quietly guarded the structure. It is one of those harsh little contradictions history is full of. The thing that injured you also protected you. There are records and traces showing that some households treated the hearth almost like a living member of the family. The fire was not to be allowed to die if it could be helped. Before sleep, people would bank it carefully beneath ash, a practice that appears under various names in later dialect, all meaning roughly the same thing. Smother it gently so it will survive until morning. If the fire failed in the night, a glowing coal might be borrowed from a neighbor. That simple act, a coal carried in a clay pot or tucked in moss to keep it alive, becomes very moving if you think about it too long. Warmth passed from one threshold to another in the dark, as if life itself were being shared by hand. You can imagine a winter lane before dawn. Snow in the ruts. Doors shut tight. One figure crossing between cottages with a covered ember held close, the dull red glow trembling with each careful step. There is something almost sacred about that. No sermon needed. No theory. Just the understanding that no one should begin the day from cold darkness if another house can spare a coal. Archaeologists have uncovered hearthstones marked with crosses, circles, and other scratched signs, and scholars argue as they should about whether these marks were pious, decorative, apotropaic, or merely casual. It hardly matters in one sense. The act of marking the hearth says enough. People paid attention to the place where fire lived. They blessed it, watched it, feared it, depended on it. They knew that one loose spark might destroy a roof, but they also knew that a room without flame was a room in which winter won. Around the hearth, all the sensory details of a medieval house gather themselves into one thick human atmosphere. A pot of pottage begins to steam. Rushes on the floor give off a faint, dusty sweetness when warmed. A sleeve is stretched near the heat to dry and releases the smell of wet sheep and lanolin. Someone turns a boot sole toward the coals, and you catch the tang of old leather. The smoke turns in lazy ribbons overhead, silver in the dim light. Somewhere near the door, a hen mutters to itself, offended by existence in general. It is all so close together. Nothing is separate. Heat, food, smell, noise, labor, all of it braided in one room. A curious practical detail survives in some descriptions of village life. When wood ran low, people burned what they had. Peat, if the region allowed it. Furza, twigs, dried dung, straw in desperate moments, though that vanished too fast to be much use. Dung sounds dreadful to us, and I admit it is not a fragrance anyone would bottle for pleasure. But once properly dry, it gave steady heat. Medieval survival had very little patience for modern squeamishness. If it burned, it mattered. By midday, the hearth is fully itself again, a low authority at the center of the room. The pot hangs over it, thick steam drifting upward. Children edge nearer, hands out, then pull back with that half-respect, half-greed common to anyone warming themselves after a cold night. The old woman by the wall squints into the smoke and tells you not to waste the best log too early. She is right. Of course. Fire is management as much as comfort. The morning blaze must not become the afternoon disappointment. This is something easy to miss when looking back romantically. Medieval warmth was rationed not only by fuel, but by judgment. Too much too soon and you shiver later. Too little and the room never really wakes. The keeper of the hearth, often a woman, sometimes an elder, sometimes simply whoever had learned the house best, held a kind of domestic power that no charter recorded, but everyone obeyed. She knew the pace at which a room could be heated, a stew thickened, a line of washing dried, a child comforted. Fire tended by intelligence becomes civilization on a small scale. As evening returns, the hearth changes function again. What was workplace and kitchen becomes circle and refuge. People shift closer. The room contracts toward the glow. The walls remain dark, almost invisible beyond a certain point, while faces and hands come forward in amber and shadow. Stories begin here, because this is where stories belong, at the edge of light, with smoke above and cold held back by mud, straw, wood, and will. The fire speaks in little snaps and sighs between human voices. There is, in some chronicled anecdotes, mention of villages pooling fire in hard weather, people gathering around a larger blaze when private hearths were too weak or fuel too scarce. Whether every such tale is strictly factual matters less than the truth it points to. Heat can be communal. Winter frequently forced that lesson. One family might own a pot, another an extra log, another a surviving coal, another simply the space to let more bodies near the warmth. Shared fire made neighbors into something closer. And yet, for all its centrality, the hearth was never a perfect friend. Sit too near and your face burns while your back freezes. Let smoke gather wrong and eyes sting until tears run. Bank the ash too heavily, and the morning finds the embers dead. Sleep too close, and sparks may mark blanket or skin. There are coroner's reports and village stories enough to remind us that people died by their fires as well as because of the cold. One scribe described an old man found beside his own warmth, his face dark with soot, as having slept too close to the blessing. It is a phrase so blunt and sad that it hardly needs embellishment. You understand, then, why medieval people mixed practicality with ritual around the hearth. A prayer said before lighting, a sign scratched in stone, herbs thrown onto embers, ale dripped into the fire for luck or sweetness. None of it was foolish in context. When so much of your life depends on something that can save you 1 hour and ruin you the next, ceremony becomes a form of respect. By late night, the work reverses. Now the task is not to build fire, but to preserve it. The pot is moved. The larger wood is consumed down. Ash is drawn carefully over the remaining glow. The room darkens without surrendering completely. This is one of the loveliest sights in medieval domestic life. I think, that deep, sleepy red under gray ash. Not dramatic flame, not bright triumph, just endurance, promise hidden, banked, waiting for morning hands. You lie down at last and watch the last open flicker settle into a hum under its veil. The walls catch the dimmest amber. The smoke finds its slow way upward. Someone coughs once, then sleeps. Outside, the wind drags a finger along the door and moves on. Inside, the hearth breathes like a tired animal that has decided, for one more night, to stay loyal. Before dawn, you wake to another sound, softer than the wind and more personal. Air entering where it should not. A draft has found the door again. You rise and pull your cloak close, cross the room, and run your fingers along the crooked edge of the wooden frame. The cold there is sharp enough to make the skin sting. Medieval houses were always negotiating with openings. Doors swelled, shrank, warped, and settled. Latches held, but wood lived its own life. Beneath the threshold, a line of frost has gathered where the outside world has argued its case all night. You push the door open a crack, and a little sheet of white dust falls from the frame. Snow or frost, shaken loose. Impossible to say. Then you close it, and begin the ordinary business of resistance. A stone at the base. A roll of cloth. Perhaps moss or sheep's wool packed into the worst gap. These are not dramatic acts, yet they matter more than grand talk. Historians and archaeologists repeatedly note how much ordinary thermal defense in medieval homes came from such humble improvisations. Wool in a crack, moss between stones, straw at a threshold, a hanging cloth across a doorway, a mat over a shutter, insulation before the word existed. The floor contributes to the cold in its own silent way. Packed earth is honest but merciless in winter. It keeps the memory of frost longer than the air does. Stand on it long enough, and the chill climbs into the bones as if from underground. Rushes spread over it help. Straw helps. Sand sometimes helps with moisture. Wealthier households might use boards, though even boards needed something over them if they were not to feel like refrigerated planks of misfortune. The floor is where the season enters quietly. Not with wind, but with contact. There are old references to people sharing space with animals in one room, partly because livestock was precious, and partly because livestock was warm. The beast corner by the door, the family nearer the hearth, a rough partition between species, and all of them contributing breath to the same air. It sounds harsh, and it was, but it was also practical. A sleeping cow or pig is a kind of furnace with opinions. One can see why a freezing household would tolerate a good deal in exchange. Even small household tricks reveal how alert people were to drafts and damp. Sheep's wool soaked in fat and packed into cracks. Moss wedged around frames. Herbs over doors more for morale than meteorology. Perhaps, though a better-smelling room is not a trivial mercy when smoke and wet wool dominate everything else. A few folklorists refer to little plugs of mixed material tucked into beams and joints, wish plugs if one wants a poetic name, carrying both practical ceiling and tiny hopes. It feels right. Medieval shelter is full of places where utility and belief overlap until there is no useful point in separating them. When the fire catches fully again, and the room begins to warm from the center outward, you notice how every one of these measures changes the sound as much as the temperature. A cloth at the door softens the wind's hiss. Rushes muffle steps. A hanging by the wall dulls the echo of voices. Better shelter sounds less exposed. That may be one reason people felt its comfort so deeply. Warmth is not only heat, it is the reduction of intrusion. The sense that the world must ask permission before entering. By now, you have begun to grasp something essential. Medieval survival in winter was not built on one grand invention. It was made from accumulations. A thicker wall, a better fitting beam, more rushes underfoot, a wiser hand at the fire, moss in the cracks, an animal in the corner, a coal from a neighbor. It is tempting to search the past for turning points, but much of human endurance is additive rather than revolutionary. Houses improved the way bodies heal, slowly, imperfectly, by layer. The fire pops. A draft still touches the back of your neck if you stand by the door too long. The floor remains cold enough to remind you where you are. Yet the room now holds itself better than it did in the night. The cold is outside, pressing in. Inside, human beings have answered with every material and habit they possess. They have built a fragile pocket of different weather, and for today it will do. By evening, the hearth glows again, and the room settles around it. The packed earth under the rushes feels less hostile. The door no longer hums at every gust. Someone hangs a blanket across the opening at last, and the cottage seems to exhale. This is not luxury. It is not even comfort in the later sense. But it is enough. In medieval England, enough was one of the great achievements. You sit with your back to the wall, warmth on your face, smoke in your hair, and think of how many nights like this have passed through houses built of mud and timber. The details change from county to county, family to family, century to century. But the central image remains. A room gathered around fire. A world of cold held just outside by intelligence, labor, and care. A little heat made to last. The next morning, the cold carries a different scent. Less straw, less smoke caught in low rafters, more damp stone, and something faintly metallic in the air, as if the day itself has been sharpened. You leave the village lane and walk uphill toward the manor, where the house of the Lord rises above the clustered cottages with a kind of heavy certainty. Its walls catch the pale light and give almost nothing back. They are not like timber or daub, which seem to belong to weather. These look as though they mean to outweight it. You lay your hand against the outer stone and feel immediately what power costs. The wall is slick with condensation, rough enough to scrape skin, and cold in a way that feels ancient rather than temporary. Stone houses, especially after the Norman centuries made them more common among those with means, projected permanence. They also projected status, ambition, and command. A peasant house asked winter for mercy and tried to negotiate. A manor declared that it intended to remain standing regardless of season, tax, vowed, or memory. Yet once you pass inside, the truth becomes more complicated. Stone keeps things out. Yes. It also keeps things in. Damp, chill, and the slow silence of heavy walls. Builders of such halls worked on a scale village cottages could only admire from a distance. Limestone, sandstone, whatever the local geology and purse allowed. hauled by oxen, cut by masons, bedded in mortar, mixed by hands that knew the feel of a good binding mixture, the way a baker knows dough. You watch one mason in the yard now, his breath lifting in white bursts as he squares a block with chisel and hammer. Each strike rings clear and hard through the winter air. Chips fall like pale shells around his boots. There is something deeply satisfying in the discipline of it, as if raw cliff is being taught the grammar of architecture. One small fact often missed in broad retellings is how much practical experimentation lived in these grand walls. Plaster strengthened with animal hair. Lime washes to brighten interiors and discourage mold. Tapestries or painted cloths hung not just for splendor, but to cover damp and soften drafts. Medieval builders did not think in our terms of insulation value and thermal bridging, but they knew very well that bare stone made a poor companion in January. So they layered over it. Cloth, rushes, timber screens, hangings, shutters, all the soft things that could make a hard room slightly more inhabitable. Inside the great hall, a fire roars in a hearth large enough to swallow the village hearth whole. Flames crack upward. Logs shift and settle. Sparks leap toward the chimney throat. The sound is impressive, and the light magnificent. Yet you step only a few paces from the blaze, and the warmth begins to thin out, as if embarrassed by the size of the room it has been asked to fill. This is the paradox of the manor. Spectacle is easy. Comfort is not. Great halls were designed to be seen as much as lived in. High roofs, open spans, elevated tables, banners, carved screens, all of it magnificent, all of it difficult to heat. Chroniclers and household accounts admit, sometimes grudgingly, that noble households were often cold despite their resources. People wore fur not because it was theatrical, though it certainly looked the part, but because even a roaring fire could not persuade heat to settle in the far corners of a stone hall. The walls sweated. The floors bit through soles. The air near the hearth might blush warm, while the shadows remained as chill as a church. Lords and ladies had wealth enough to command labor and materials, but not enough to repeal the behavior of winter inside masonry. Some historians like to say that such buildings were more about display than comfort, and there is truth there. A manor needed to look strong. It needed to host, judge, feast, and intimidate. Domestic ease was often secondary. Yet it would be unfair to imagine these households as indifferent to warmth. They tried. Great fires, wall hangings, shutters, glazed or horn-covered openings, where possible, smaller side chambers for private use, raised beds with curtains, warming pans, heated bricks, braziers. In some contexts, all these were answers, if imperfect ones. The problem was not ignorance. It was scale and material. You move through the hall and notice how sound behaves here. Every footstep on the flagstones echoes with authority. A dropped cup rings. A cough travels. Voices become smaller as they rise into the high dark above. Smoke stains the rafters black despite the size of the chimney. Candles flicker in side sconces and give off more atmosphere than heat. Somewhere under the stronger smells of wood smoke, tallow, damp wool, and the faint mineral scent of wet mortar, you catch something sweeter. perhaps mulled wine, perhaps a herb crushed underfoot in the rushes. Even grandeur, it seems, depends on little domestic tricks. There are old stories of beds prepared like fortresses against cold, curtains drawn tight around heavy frames, furs layered over linen, warming bricks or heated stones slipped beneath blankets by servants before the lord or lady retired. In such moments, the bed became a room within the room, a private climate made by cloth and labor. It is one of the recurring themes of medieval shelter. When broad architecture fails to hold warmth, human beings create smaller spaces inside it that can. A serving woman passes carrying a pan of ash to scatter on icy steps. Her sleeves are rolled. Her face glows from kitchen heat, not because she is fortunate, but because kitchens are among the few places in a great house where warmth gathers honestly. If the hall is a theater of power, the kitchen is its hidden furnace. Ovens, hearths, boiling vats, roasting spits, all create a climate so different from the outer chambers that servants are said to linger there for reasons that had very little to do with duty. One can hardly blame them. In many castles and manors, the route from kitchen to corridor must have felt like walking out of one season into another. You leave the hall by a side door and walk back downhill toward the cottages. The distance is not great. That is part of the point. Medieval life often arranged stark material contrasts within sight of one another. The manor glows with timbered grandeur and disciplined labor. Below it, a peasant cottage crouches close to the earth, patched and smoky, and low enough that a tall man must bow to enter. Yet when you step inside the smaller space, something curious happens. The air feels warmer. The room is tiny, no more than a single chamber with a partition for beasts, if the family has any. But heat behaves kindly here because it has less distance to travel. A small fire, a pot of pottage, bodies near one another, a roof held low, and suddenly winter is not conquered, but made negotiable. This is one of the truths that unsettles simple ideas about class and comfort. Wealth bought stronger walls and finer materials. Poverty sometimes, by accident or necessity, produced better thermal intimacy. A large hall could be majestic and miserable. A small hut could be filthy and warm. The family inside this one looks up when you enter. The woman by the pot smiles without stopping her stirring. The man near the partition nods once. Children lie under coarse blankets with only their eyes showing, like suspicious little saints in a smoky icon. The goat shifts and gives you a look, suggesting that you have no business arriving without food. The smell here is everything at once. Onion, barley, old smoke, wool, damp earth, animal breath, and the faint sourness of stored things meeting heat. It is thick, yes, but it is also alive. The manor hall felt imposing. This feels inhabited. It is well established that peasant cottages often measured less than 20 feet in length and served every purpose in one compressed space. Cooking, eating, sleeping, storage, mending, childbirth, illness, prayer, argument, all within arm's reach of the same hearth. Privacy was almost non-existent. Practicality governed arrangement. The most valuable item in many such homes may have been the iron pot over the fire, inherited if luck held, repaired if possible, cherished always. Around that pot the economy of the house turned. Broth for the sick, pottage for the strong, water heated for washing, something always simmering, if not richly, then hopefully. A curious old custom survives in the finding of hidden shoes above doors and in chimney corners. Worn shoes tucked into the fabric of the house, perhaps against evil, perhaps for luck, perhaps because old leather with the shape of a human life pressed into it felt too significant to throw away carelessly. The same logic appears in charms buried under thresholds or in scraps of pottery pushed into wet daub. Houses were not inert things to the people who lived in them. They remembered. They received offerings. They were asked, in little gestures, to continue protecting those within. The social divide between manor and cottage was enormous in law. Diet, burden, and opportunity. No soft storytelling should blur that. Yet winter does strange work on hierarchies. It humiliates everyone differently. Even kings complained of freezing halls. Even lords measured the approach of fuel shortages. Even the fine bed curtains and tapestries of the wealthy were essentially attempts to make a smaller, warmer pocket inside a larger, colder truth. The peasant simply worked on a smaller scale from the beginning. You sit near the cottage fire and think about how both kinds of house answer the same question. How do you live beneath a sky that punishes thin walls, damp roofs, and careless planning? One answer is thickness and stone and labor commanded from many hands. Another is compactness, flexibility, and the closeness of people and beasts around a single center of heat. Neither answer is perfect. Both reveal a society improvising within material limits. By late afternoon, you return once more toward the village edge where another cottage wall is being repaired. Here, the old technique of wattle and daub comes into focus again, and after stone, the sight is almost startling in its tenderness. Upright stakes, woven rods, clay mixed with straw and dung, pressed into a lattice by bare hands. It seems at first glance too gentle to stand against weather. Then you look closer and see how intelligent it is. The wall is not rigid like stone. It flexes. It can be reopened, patched, remade. Cracks do not mean catastrophe. They mean tomorrow's work. Archaeological finds across England confirm the widespread use of wattle and daub for ordinary buildings. The materials were local, the skills communal, the technology, if one calls it that, was forgiving. A damaged section could be reworked without dismantling a whole structure. The woven hazel or willow beneath provided support and a little movement. The daub itself, once dried, cut wind effectively enough to make the difference between hardship and disaster. Whitewash over the surface brightened the room and helped against damp and pests. If stone architecture was a claim to permanence, wattle and daub was an agreement with seasonality. This wall will stand. Then it will crack. Then we will mend it. Then it will stand again. A woman presses fresh daub into a weak place now, her fingers moving with the certainty of memory. Beside her, a young boy passes handfuls of the mixture from a wooden tub, trying not to wrinkle his nose too dramatically at the dung content, though failing in a way that makes everyone else laugh. Handprints remain briefly in the wet patch before she smooths them away. I have always found it strangely moving that archaeologists sometimes discover precisely such prints, preserved through accident, children's fingers and walling material, small evidence that building a house was never just engineering. It was family labor fixed briefly in mud. The smell of fresh daub is strong. Clay, straw, water, manure, and the faint green smell of split rods beneath. Not pleasant in a refined sense, but rich with purpose. A peculiar note in folk record suggests that some builders added ale, blood, or egg to mixtures for strength or luck. Whether chemically useful in every case or not, such additives remind you how experimental traditional building could be. People observed, remembered, copied, adjusted. Medieval architecture at the village level was empirical long before anyone used that word. As evening drops and the repaired wall begins to darken in the cold air, you stand back and see how modest and how brave it looks. The cottage nearby leans slightly. The roof is patched. The door is crooked. Smoke stains run above the opening. Yet the wall will hold. The family working on it knows this in their hands, even if they would never phrase it academically. They have built enough winters to trust the feel of the material. There is wisdom there, and it deserves more respect than the word humble sometimes allows. Somewhere above on the hill, the manor windows begin to glow. Down here, so do the cottage doors and smoke holes. Thin columns of gray lift into the dusk from both worlds. The contrast remains. Fur above, rough wool below. Stone on the hill, earth underfoot. But the evening cold touches both. The fires answer both. The smell of supper enters both by different paths, and there is another quiet point that lingers. Magnitude impresses. Nearness shelters. A great hall can dominate the eye, but a low room with laughter, shared broth, and a goat breathing in the corner can do more for the body on a freezing night. Historians debate comforts, statuses, meanings, and rightly so. Yet if you ask the winter wind itself, I suspect it would admit that it fears the tightly gathered little house more than the grand stone one. In small spaces, people become difficult to defeat. You walk home under a darkening sky while frost starts to silver the edges of puddles again. In one lane, a child is called indoors. In another, a servant from the manor hurries with a covered dish and resents the weather exactly as much as any plowman. From somewhere comes the sound of a latch, then the softer sound of a bar laid across a door. Houses close themselves for the night. Inside your own lodging, modest though it is, the fire receives you without ceremony. The room is smoky and imperfect. The wall near the door still wants another patch. The rushes need replacing soon. Yet when you sit and stretch your hands toward the heat, you understand with unusual clarity that medieval shelter was never a single story of progress, from poor to rich, from weak to strong. It was a set of parallel answers to the same relentless climate. Each answer shaped by means, status, material, and memory. The stone manor endures because many hands can command quarry, cart, mortar, and craft. The peasant cottage endures because many hands can gather straw, weave rods, bank coals, share walls, and mend without end. Both are human refusals. Both are negotiations with weather. Both stand because people decided repeatedly that standing mattered. When the fire settles lower and the room begins to dim, you think of the mason's hammer on stone and the woman's hand smoothing fresh daub. Such different gestures, and yet they belong to the same country, the same season, the same long struggle against wet cold. Medieval England was built from both sounds at once, the ring of chisel and the slap of mud, the command of power and the patience of need. The winter listened to both and kept pressing. The houses answered in their own dialects, and for another night, the answer was enough. Morning opens with the sound of bells. Not one bell, but several, each arriving through the pale air with its own weight, one from the abbey, one from the parish church, and perhaps another from somewhere farther off where the town begins. The frost has made the world feel thin and bright. Every sound carries farther. Every bootstep on frozen ground seems more deliberate than it did in autumn. You walk first toward the abbey because in winter a monastery is more than a place of prayer. It is an argument against disorder. The gate is damp with cold. Stone walls rise around the inner courts, and they hold the night inside them even after dawn has begun. The smell here is different from the village. Less animal, less wood smoke trapped in thatch, more wet mortar, old wax, damp wool, and the faint medicinal scent of herbs drying somewhere out of sight. Medieval monastic life was built around rule and repetition, and in winter that repetition became a form of shelter all its own. The monks endured the season not by defeating it, but by dividing it into hours, bells, psalms, stories, meals, silence, and prayer. If the body could not command the weather, perhaps the mind could still arrange the day. You cross the cloister slowly. The flagstones are cold enough to ache through your soles. Moisture beads on the carved columns. Beyond the arches, a narrow garden lies silver with frost. Every herb, bed, and bare stem traced in white. It is beautiful in the restrained, almost severe way that many monastic places are beautiful. Nothing here seeks to charm. It seeks to endure. The brothers move through it wrapped in dark habits, their sleeves close, their hands hidden or clasped, their breath rising in little clouds that dissolve as quickly as prayer itself. Records from monastic houses in medieval England make it clear that abbeys and priories were both holy spaces and practical machines. They stored food, brewed ale, copied books, treated the sick, housed travelers, managed sheep, oversaw tenants, and maintained buildings on a scale most villages could not. In winter, this administrative order mattered. Grain had to be counted. Fuel had to be rationed. Cloaks had to be mended. Fires had to be confined to the right places. A monastery that failed at practical management could not afford spiritual grandeur for very long. You enter the refectory and find that even here warmth is selective. The room is large, the stone still cold, yet the bodies of the monks and the steam from porridge make the air feel less cruel than the cloister. No one speaks. Wooden bowls touch the tables with a soft knock. Spoons move. A reader at one end murmurs from a text while the others eat in disciplined quiet. The smell of oat or barley porridge rises thick and plain. No one pretends it is luxurious. That is not the point. Hot food taken in order is its own mercy. There are accounts from monasteries noting the existence of warming houses, small chambers where a fire was kept and where monks, by permission and at appointed times, could warm themselves briefly. I have always found that detail very human. An entire institution devoted to prayer and labor still had to make room for thawing fingers. Imagine how precious such a room must have felt. The only proper fire outside the kitchen, a place entered with restraint, almost like a chapel dedicated to bodily survival. The rule might say moderation. The hands would say gratitude. In some houses, the cleverness went further. Heat from kitchens was used where possible. Sleeping quarters might be placed above warmer rooms. Certain walls grew warmer than others because of adjacent ovens or workspaces. Here and there later, medieval builders experimented with underfloor channels or flues. Not central heating in the modern sense, but thoughtful attempts to move warmth where it was needed most. It is tempting to think of the Middle Ages as indifferent to comfort, but that is never quite right. People sought comfort constantly. They simply did so within material and moral limits, very different from ours. You pass through a narrow passage and catch the smell of bread from the bakehouse. It is almost startling after the chill stone and incense. Warm grain, yeast, smoke, and the sweet dampness of dough rising near heat. A novice carries a basket of loaves with the solemnity of a relic procession, though one gets the sense he is mostly trying not to drop them. Above such rooms, it is said, some brothers slept better than elsewhere because warmth climbed through the boards. I hope that is true. It feels like the sort of small monastic conspiracy against winter that history should allow. In the scriptorium, the cold announces itself differently. Ink thickens. Fingers stiffen. Parchment resists. A monk leans over his page and pauses now and then, not because he lacks devotion, but because his hand needs to remember how to move. Candlelight trembles on the desk. The smell is wax, skin, scraped vellum, soot. He writes anyway. There is something almost unreasonable about copying a text in such air. And yet this is how so much survived, by letter, while the world outside froze. The room is quiet, except for the tiny sounds of work, the scratch of quill, the cough quickly suppressed, the shifting of wool on wood, and under it all the winter silence of stone. One chronicler tells a story of a novice trying to smuggle extra warmth into his cell, carrying a coal wrapped in cloth. He was caught, confessed, and forgiven after agreeing to share the heat rather than keep it selfishly. Whether every detail is exact or improved in retelling, the lesson feels perfectly medieval. Warmth in such communities had a moral shape. One fire, many hands. One loaf, many mouths. One room where fingers might briefly live again before returning to ink and prayer. When the bell calls the brothers to chapel, you go with them. Inside the church, the cold is vast, but so is the sound. Chant lifts into the rafters and returns softened. Breath turns visible in the dim air, so that prayer itself seems to have body for a moment. Candles burn with little circles of authority near the altar. Wax and old stone mix in the nose. The floor beneath the rushes or straw is unyielding. Yet the room holds another kind of shelter, one not based on heat exactly, but on order and repetition and the shared conviction that morning prayer should happen, whether fingers are warm enough or not. From the abbey, you make your way toward the parish church in the village or town below. If the monastery is disciplined endurance, the parish church is broader and more communal. It belongs to the people who kneel there, with numb feet and babies under cloaks, to the old man whose cough echoes through the nave, to the woman who brings hot stones wrapped in cloth to hold during a long sermon because faith is easier when your hands still belong to you. Parish records and church accounts note such practical improvisations. Straw renewed on floors, candles counted. Sometimes braziers used during vigils despite clerical disapproval. The clergy could frown at smoke while the people quietly preferred not to freeze. You push open the church door, and the smell greets you first. Beeswax, if the parish is lucky. Tallow, if not. Damp stone always. Old timber. A trace of incense from a feast day that still lingers as a memory more than a scent. Light from narrow windows falls in blue and red and pale gold where glass exists, or in simple gray shafts where it does not. The church is cold, yes, but less empty than the abbey. Here there are wool cloaks, boots leaving wet marks, whispered prayers, a dog near the threshold, a baby making the soft complaining noise babies make in every century when brought somewhere colder than is fair. Churches in winter were not heated in any full sense, but they were used as shelters in both spiritual and practical ways. During storms, during deep snow, during fear, people gathered under those roofs because stone and community together made a kind of refuge. There are stories, some documented better than others, of villagers sleeping in churches during the worst weather, of shared bread after services, of church interiors made briefly domestic by bodies and necessity. A church could be the village holding itself together when smaller houses were too vulnerable. An interesting detail from parish life is the use of hot stones. Heated at home and carried under cloaks, they turn up in records and local memory as a small technology of devotion. Imagine a man or woman leaving before dawn, stone wrapped in rags, tucked against the palms or under the arms, while walking through frost to hear Mass. It is such a modest act of planning, and yet it transforms endurance. Medieval warmth often works this way, not as one grand solution, but as tiny pieces of foresight carried through the dark. The priest's voice rises, low and measured. The congregation answers. Sound gathers and settles in the arches. A woman near the front bows her head, and you see a line of melted frost on the back of her hood where it has thawed indoors. A laborer shifts his weight from one foot to the other because the flagstones are climbing through his boots. Two children share one blanket over their knees. A little smoke from a side brazier drifts upward and stains the stone a little more for future centuries to discover. Religion here is not abstract. It is embodied in cold bodies insisting on ritual. By the time you leave the church, the day has brightened a little, and you head toward the town. The change announces itself first in density. Houses pressed together. Streets narrow. The wind no longer sweeps cleanly over fields, but curls and hesitates between walls and overhanging upper stories. Medieval towns were warmer in some ways, simply because they were crowded. Municipal records and archaeological work both make this plain. Narrow lanes blocked drafts. Shared walls let one household borrow another's heat. Workshops below and sleeping lofts above meant daily labor rose into domestic life as warmth. The town, for all its smells and grime, made a climate of its own. You enter through mud and noise. A cart creaks. A pig protests being a pig in public. Someone is chopping wood in a yard no larger than a handkerchief. A baker's oven vents warm, yeasty air into the lane, and the effect is so immediate it feels almost miraculous. Townhouses rise in timbered fronts, some stories leaning over the street as if eager to hear gossip from across the way. Their upper floors almost meet. Their lower rooms open onto trade. Leather, cloth, bread, ala, metal. Everything smells of work, smoke, and wet wool. Municipal records from places like York, Norwich, and London show narrow plots built upward because land inside walls was valuable. The lower floor often served as shop or workshop. Above, the family lived, slept, mended, and stored. The very compression of town life trapped warmth. A house that touched its neighbors on both sides lost less heat than a lone cottage in an open field. Overlapping roofs created alleys of shadow and some shelter from rain. In upper rooms, where the heat from shop, hearth, animals, and bodies all rose together, winter could be made almost bearable. You duck into one such house. The first thing you notice is the wall beside the hearth. It is warm. Not hot, but warm enough to surprise the hand. The room smells of barley stew, tallow, drying cloth, and a sharper note beneath it, coal. In towns, access to river trade and carted fuel meant coal could appear earlier and more often than in many rural villages. Contemporary complaints about sea coal in larger towns are nearly comic in their irritation. Bitter smoke, foul air, blackened walls. Yet no one abandoned it willingly, because it burns steadily and winter does not care about a critic's delicate nose. The mother at the fire stirs a pot, while the father repairs something wooden, perhaps a shoe form or tool handle, perhaps a toy, perhaps both at once, because medieval households wasted very little distinction between useful and affectionate labor. Upstairs, children move in the loft. You hear them through the floorboards. The room is smoky, yes, but its heat is immediate. Pressed close by walls, bodies, and low ceilings. There is no grandeur here. There is function, and function can feel unexpectedly kind. Some townhouses incorporated vertical flues or channels near the hearth that warmed adjoining walls as smoke rose. Not universal, not elegant by our standards, but clever. A kind of early wall heating born not from scientific theory, but from generations noticing that smoke passing through brick or plaster left warmth behind. In a city where houses stood shoulder to shoulder, such small refinements mattered. A warmer wall could mean a healthier room, a better sleep, a child less likely to wake blue-handed. There are records, too, of neighbors sharing more than mere proximity. Connecting doors in attics, shared ovens, shared walls, shared courtyards where laundry froze by noon and thawed again by the kitchen vent. In the worst winters, social boundaries softened under the pressure of the season. not out of sentiment alone, out of physics. Heat shared is heat multiplied when every dwelling leaks some part of itself into the next. Yet the city also has its cruel edges. Walk beyond the more established streets, and you reach the margins where those without secure rights or enough coin made shelter from whatever the town shed. Broken planks, old carts, scrap cloth, ditches near walls, leans against gate towers. Chroniclers note them, sometimes with pity, sometimes with irritation, often without much comprehension. The poor at the edge of the town survived on borrowed heat in every sense. Warmth from gate fires, from charity broth, from the lee of a wall, from the tolerance of guards not too strict on bitter nights. You walk there now, and the contrast is immediate. Smoke turns meaner. The smell is harsher. Anything that burns is being burned. Reed, rags, dung, chips, small stolen wood. A child crouches by a low fire built directly on frozen ground. The flames are weak but determined. In some town records there are mentions of the destitute sleeping by gate fires to keep the iron from freezing, benefiting from warmth intended for architecture rather than mercy. One almost laughs at the bleak practicality of it, except the image is too sad. Still, even here winter engineering persists. Hot stones carried inside clothes, bundles of straw under bodies, rags packed into gaps, a roof made from nothing but refusal to remain unsheltered. Medieval survival among the poorest is perhaps the purest form of ingenuity because it strips away any illusion that architecture is always grand. Sometimes it is simply a board placed where the wind was planning to enter. As dusk begins to lower itself over town, chimneys and vents release smoke into the same dimming sky. Abbey, church, merchant house, workshop, hovel by the gate, castle kitchen, village cottage, different fuels, different rites, different hungers, but the same long labor of making a pocket of warmth inside a cold country. Bells sound again somewhere behind you, and the sound rolls over roofs and walls as if the whole settlement were one breathing thing. You stop on a corner where the air holds bread, coal smoke, horse breath, wet plaster, and the faint medicinal sweetness of herbs from a nearby apothecary. Above, shutters close one by one. Light glows through horn panes and between boards. Somewhere a loom knocks. Somewhere a hymn begins. Somewhere a man curses his fire and then feeds it anyway. Medieval England in winter was never one shelter type, one class, one solution. It was a whole landscape of answers, improvised according to means, material, faith, and luck. You walk back into the dark with that understanding settling into you. The abbey taught discipline. The church offered communal refuge. The town trapped heat by crowding life close. The poorest gathered warmth from scraps. All of it was shelter. Not perfect, never final, always maintained. And all of it depended on people willing to keep doing the small, repetitive acts that held the season at bay. A coal banked, a shutter closed, a rush floor renewed, a wall mended, a pot kept simmering, a bell answered. By the time you reach your room again, Your hands smell of stone and smoke and cold iron from a latch you lifted somewhere along the way. You sit near the fire and think about how winter reveals systems. Not just buildings, but habits, institutions, kindnesses, permissions, and inequalities. Shelter is never only walls. It is also the arrangement of a society around vulnerability. Who gets thick stone? Who gets shared heat? Who gets a seat near the hearth? Who stands at the gate? Who carries the coal? Who writes the rule? Who breaks it gently so someone else may stay warm? The fire settles to a steady orange. Outside, the bells stop. For tonight, that is enough. The houses hold. The smoke rises. The people breathe through another freezing dark. And the dark, for now, does not take them. The cold does not leave all at once. That would be too kind. And medieval England rarely offered kindness in such dramatic shapes. Instead, the season loosens its grip, finger by finger. One morning, there is a softer note in the air when you open the door. Another day, the eaves begin to drip before noon. Then comes the first afternoon, when mud appears beneath the snow, and everyone complains about it, with a strange relief people reserve for discomfort that signals survival. You wake to that dripping now. Slow at first, then more regular. Little beads of thaw tapping from the roof edge into the half-frozen yard. The sound is delicate enough to be mistaken for someone far away mending something with careful tools. The air inside the cottage still smells of smoke, wool, and last night's broth, but beneath it is a new scent, damp earth beginning to think about itself again. Outside, the fields are not yet green. Not truly, but they no longer look dead. They look tired. Chroniclers and manor accounts describe this late winter and early thaw period with a kind of wary respect. It was relief, yes, but also hunger, mud, repairs, and uncertainty. The stores were low. Roofs sagged where snow had sat too long. Walls showed what the frost had done. Roads turned from hard ruts to sucking channels of clay. The season did not end. It changed terms. Yet even that change carried hope, because motion had returned to the world. Water ran. Birds spoke. Breath hurt less. You walk past the cottages and see doors opened wider than they have been in weeks. Not flung back in celebration, just unlatched longer, enough to let the rooms breathe. Smoke no longer seems trapped under the low sky. It rises thinner, less desperate. Women shake out blankets. Men scrape soot from hearthstones. Children splash where they were forbidden to go in December. The village smells of ash, wet straw, thawing dung, and fresh cut air. It is not pretty in any polished sense, but it is full of release. There are records of spring cleaning that make the whole business feel almost ceremonial. Ashes from winter fires taken out and scattered. Old rushes swept away from floors. New ones prepared if available. Walls inspected. Tools mended. Roof cords tightened. Whatever winter had stained, dampened, or blackened was dragged toward daylight and judged. It was practical, absolutely, but it was also symbolic. Months of smoke, sickness, and compressed breathing had settled into every surface. To clean a house now was to say to the season, "You had your turn." One custom mentioned in a parish note speaks of opening doors and shutters for a full day at the first convincing thaw, a kind of airing out not only of the room but of misfortune. Releasing the night. Some called it in one region. I like that phrase very much. It suggests that winter had become a presence within the house, something with weight and temper that needed eventually to be let go. Whether it chased away disease or not, it certainly changed the mind. Fresh air has moral force after a long, smoky season. At the edge of the fields, men are already testing the ground with boots and spades. They bend, touch the soil, rub it between fingers, and nod or shake their heads with the seriousness of judges. The smell of thawed earth rises rich and dark, a little sweet, a little sour, unmistakably alive. Beside them, boys carry repaired tools, awkwardly proud of the responsibility. Women patch sacks. Someone checks a fence half pushed down by months of wet and frost. In every gesture there is forward lean. Winter has made everyone defensive. Spring, even before it fully arrives, makes them offensive again. Archaeological traces and written records both tell the same story here. The end of winter meant immediate labor. Hearths were cleaned, but also fields prepared, barns examined, remaining wood counted, peat stacks judged, animal stalls cleared. The rhythm of survival did not soften. It simply shifted from keeping in warmth to making use of it. The great medieval trick was never laziness disguised as patience. It was patience yoked to work. A rather touching custom from some districts speaks of small field fires lit at the first thaw. Not large blazes, just enough flame to mark gratitude or encourage the land awake. Dried herbs or old rushes might be thrown on, and the smoke drifted low over the damp ground, like a blessing and a warning mixed together. We survived. It seemed to say, now let the earth survive with us. Inside the cottage, the fire is smaller now. Still needed, still central, but no longer the single tyrant around which all movement must arrange itself. Cooking can happen with less urgency. The room can tolerate a little chill near the walls, because daylight lasts longer and the body trusts the world more. The animals are restless. A pig noses the door. A goat complains with renewed ambition. A hen studies the yard as if offended that winter dares still leave traces. Their impatience is contagious. The rushes on the floor release a stronger smell as damp warmth enters the room. Herbs mixed among them wake too. Thyme, sage, perhaps rosemary, if anyone had it, or simpler, local greens if not. The whole house begins to smell less like confinement and more like a place in transition. You crouch near the hearth and scrape loose a scale of soot from the stone. It flakes into your hand like the memory of months. Some of it will go to the midden, some perhaps to the garden. The fire that once defended the house now gives its remains back to the soil. There are old notes of people exchanging small gifts at the change of season. Eggs, if hens had resumed. Herbs. A candle stub saved from feast days. A heel of better bread. Not grand charity, just the acknowledgement that winter had been passed together. Medieval villages could gossip, resent, divide, and injure. Of course they could. But they also knew that some seasons could not be crossed alone. Physical closeness had taught moral memory. One remembered who shared a coal, who lent a pot, who patched a roof, who took in a child during a storm. You walk to the river and find it finally free of its gray skin of ice. Water runs dark and bright around the reeds. The sound after weeks of stillness is extraordinary. Not loud, just continuous. The river had seemed asleep. Now it is speaking again, and with it comes a sense that the whole land is exhaling. Nearby, a few people cut rushes for floors, mats, bedding, and all the many domestic uses that plants from the riverbank could serve. Even this belongs to the story of shelter. Warmth in medieval England did not come only from walls and roofs. It came from 1,000 gathered things: moss from wood edges, straw from fields, reeds from water, clay from pits, wool from backs, wood from copses, ash from old fires. There is a proverb recorded later, but likely older in spirit, that says new rushes bring new luck. Replace the floor and change the fortune. One can smile at that, but not dismiss it. A clean floor, a dry floor, a better smelling floor. These are not trivial improvements after a winter lived inches above damp earth. Medieval people did not separate practical life from symbolic life the way modern minds often try to. If new rushes kept the feet warmer and the spirits higher, why should those be considered different achievements? By noon, the village sounds have changed. Less coughing, more hammering, less huddled silence, more talk carried across yards. A woman scrubs bowls outside. A man patches a cartwheel. Somewhere cloth is beaten clean. Somewhere, someone is already thatching a weak patch before the spring rains can prove its weakness publicly. The carpenter, who in winter shaped beams with hands split by frost, now works with sleeves pushed up. The same village, the same people, but the weather has altered the posture of every body in it. Even the great houses change their behavior. The manor, which in deep winter glowed like a frozen heart, trying to convince itself it was warm, now opens itself a little. Tapestries are shaken. Ash is spread on slick paths. The hall no longer needs a fire large enough to impress a foreign envoy with its determination. Smaller hearths suffice. Servants carry bedding into air. Dogs stretch in weak sun. Stone remains stone, cold in its core. But the war between wall and season has become less bitter. At the abbey, the change is subtler, perhaps, but just as real. Cloisters smell wetter, cleaner. The herb garden hints at return. Brothers move a little faster because hands do not protest so violently. The warming house becomes less desperate and more ordinary. In the scriptorium, ink behaves a fraction better. Candles gutter less from drafts because windows and shutters can be managed with more confidence. The church, too, feels altered. It is still cold, certainly, but no longer severe. Light through the windows begins to look less like rescue and more like blessing. Some historians ask what warmth meant to medieval people. The answer, I think, lies not in a definition but in accumulation. Warmth was the roof that did not collapse. The wall that did not crack too badly. The ember that lasted till dawn. The neighbor who shared a loaf. The animal breathing on the other side of the partition. The bed curtain. The rush floor. The bread oven still giving heat after baking. The horn pane turning, hard winter light gentle. The monastery kitchen under a dormitory. The city wall breaking the wind. The church holding a crowd during a storm. Warmth was never one thing. It was an ecology of care and craft. You return at dusk to a hill above the village and look down at the settlement that has occupied so many of your thoughts. The roofs shine damply instead of white. Thin smoke trails lift calm and pale into evening. Lanes still hold mud and shadow, but there is movement in them, not just endurance. The cottages no longer crouch under snow. They seem to lift their backs a little. Even the poorest shelters at the edge of town look less doomed when the frost no longer rules every board and rag. A rather tender line from an old prayer book says, "The heart keeps the fire when the wood is gone." It is the sort of sentence that risks sentiment until you have watched a hard season closely enough. Then it becomes exact. Firewood runs low. Peat stacks shrink. Chimneys fail. Walls crack. Yet still people patch, bank, share, mend, and begin again. Medieval survival was not beautiful because it was easy. It was beautiful because so much of it consisted in refusing to abandon one another or the skills that made one another livable. The sun lowers. Water in the ruts catches gold. Children run where they would have crept in ice. A cat sleeps in a doorway fully open to the mild air. A woman hums while washing a pot. A man carries ash to the field and spreads it with a practiced swing. There is no triumphal scene here. No sudden music. Just the slow restoration of ordinary life, which after winter is more moving than any fanfare. You think back through everything the season required. Mud walls and thick stone, thatch and timber, hearth smoke and chimneys, shared walls in towns, beast corners and huts, gate fires for the poor, curtain beds in manors, warming houses in abbeys, rush floors, horn windows, hidden charms, hot stones in church, herbs on coals, bread ovens cooling through the night, wood watches in the forest, every answer partial, every answer human. The frost will return. Of course. That is part of the compact. Medieval people knew it better than anyone. England does not become gentle forever simply because one thaw succeeds. But that knowledge never prevented spring from feeling like grace. Not abstract grace. Not decorative grace. Useful grace. Mud instead of ice. Drip instead of stillness. Thin smoke instead of choking haze. One can live a long time on signs like that. As dark comes on, the first stars show above fields, still wet from thaw. The village below is quieter now. Fires burn for comfort rather than emergency. The smoke rises straight. Somewhere, someone is telling a story not to distract from hunger or fear, but simply because evening has arrived and there is time enough to speak. That may be one of the most profound shifts of all. Warmth gives back time. It turns necessity into life again. You stand for one last moment and breathe the air. It carries damp soil, old smoke, fresh water, and distant wood. The country smells like recovery. Behind you, the season that tried to break every weak seam in every house has finally retreated. Before you, the houses hold. Not perfect, not grand, but sufficient. That has always been the true miracle. Not invulnerability. Sufficiency maintained through labor, memory, and care. Then you turn toward home, toward the faint glow in the doorway and the smaller kinder fire waiting inside. The path is muddy. The night is cool, but the fear is gone from it. The walls know what to do now. The roof knows how to shed what falls. The hearth knows how to keep a coal alive until morning. And you, after all these months of smoke and frost and patient human craft, know it too. Good night.